discussion. Okay, so welcome everybody. Boker Tov. It's a pleasure to welcome back Rabbi Dweck, the third of our three-part series on Sephardic, the effect of the Enlightenment on Sephardic Jewry. And this week's topic, I believe, is Western Sephardim as a model moving forward. If you like Rabbi Dweck, let me know, and then we can invite him to come back again. So you can email me privately and let us know. We can do a poll afterwards, and I'm sure I expect a lot of positive, feedback. Hey, Rabbi Dweck, a pleasure. Vakasha.
Thank you, Rabbi Kalman. What I'm going to do for this one, because this is a question of the contribution of the Western Sephardi approach in general, I'm going to offer a source sheet for people, which I put into the chat. You can click on that and open it up on Sepharia, because there are some things that some sources that I'd like to look at. Because what I'm suggesting today is not history. What I'm suggesting today is future. And if we're going to look at the future, then it is very important to have a sense as to what is the basis for the thinking, for the ideas that I want to share with you today. And the truth of the matter is that these ideas are not exclusively Sephardic, right? But they are the nature or the way that the Western Sephardim in general have looked at things, and how it is that I believe we should be approaching things given the current situation. But I believe it's the way we should always be approaching things, and it is very much the way that Sephardim have been doing things for a long time. So before we get into the actual nitty-gritty as to what exactly it is that I'd like to look at in terms of how we move forward and what it is that we can draw, I do want to take a look at the Western Sephardim a little bit closer, and specifically how it is that things have happened in that realm. So we've mentioned in the past that the Sephardim in general had an approach to the world that was specifically integrating with regards to the world itself. I'm going to just ask if everyone, I don't think that I'm a host. I don't know, am I a host? Can we just make sure to mute? If everybody wouldn't mind to please mute so that I can.
Rabbi, you are a co-host, and if you want to share your screen, that's even better.
Oh, okay, I can do that as well. I shall share my screen. I shall share my screen as well. Sure. But what I am going to do is I'm going to mute everyone. Although you can, here you are, you can unmute if you like, Rabbi Kalman. And I shall also share my screen, right? So that's what I will do. But here, I'm just going to bring it up so that we have it. But it's important to understand that the Sephardim in general, and this is very much the way, what you might call an Andalusian approach, right? The Andalus was the southern Spain, right, where the Rambam was born and raised, Cordoba and Malaga, and these areas. And the approach of these Hachamim, although it did not originate with them, and we definitely see it in the Talmud, is that there is a recognition that the world that God created is an expression of God. And that the way that he presents himself to us is through the creation of the world. And that if we are going to come to know God, which we know there is a command to us, right? We are commanded to know him. As it says, right? That you must know God. Harambam writes that the mitzvah is to know God, not just to believe in God. And he then says the way to know God is to study the world that he created. Now, others will say, well, the only real way to know God is to study Torah, because it's the book that he wrote. And what the Sephardim say is, well, of course, one can come to know God through studying Torah, but it is not the only way to know God. And what the Torah does, and this is what we're also going to speak about today, what the Torah does is it offers us a framework from which to be able to understand the world that we see. Yes? It gives us a lens with which to be able to understand the world. That's why you might have heard it mentioned many times. It's mentioned in Pirkei Avot that the Torah is called the Kli Chemda. right? It's called a vessel. It is a precious and loved vessel. A vessel for what? It's a vessel for thought and understanding, as we're going to see. So some of the things I'm going to bring on the source sheet that I'm going to show you is that that's precisely what is the Torah is meant to be for us, or at least an aspect that Torah is meant to be for us, very, very importantly. But that does not mean that the world that God created is not a mode for us to be able to come to understand Him. It is an expression of God. The creation of God is not something that is separate from Him. It is not something that is disassociated from Him. It is something that is the expression of who He is and how it is we can come to know Him. Because what we do know is we cannot know God in His essence, in what He actually is, because He's completely divorced from us as human beings. We have absolutely no relationship to God in terms of our qualitative and existential being. So the only thing that we do have to know God with is through His expressions, right? The way that He puts Himself out in the world. I've given so many classes that I don't recall if I mentioned this last time when I was with you, but I seem to remember that I might have mentioned that point to you before and given a more elaborate example of that. So what I want to show to you is this. God, so Harambam talks about this in various places. Maimonides, right? He talks about this in various places, and Maimonides really is the great grandfather of this thought that ended up developing all the way down until recent times, right? But there's a specific school of thought that basically recognizes, and this is what I used to, this is a line that I say very, very often. My students have already begun to repeat this, which I'm happy that they do. And I mentioned this, as I think I mentioned last time, that when I was head of school of Bar Yeshiva in Brooklyn, that was the motto. The motto that I put out to the parents, to the teachers, to the students was, the author of the Torah is the author of the world, and there are no contradictions. And that a way to be able to come to know God is through His authorship of the world, right? So I'm going to show to you over here this source so that I'll share it up here on the screen. And this is simply a halacha first in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, right? So everybody can see this, right? We're here. What Harambam is talking about is the love of God. And he says that we have a mitzvah to love God. That's in the previous thing, right? He says, Ha'el hanichbad ve'anora hazeh mitzvah le'ahava le'ohavo u'lira'auto. Right? There is a mitzvah that we're talking about over here. This great God that Harambam spent the first chapter of Hilchot Yesodei Torah talking about. He says there is a command to love Him and to fear Him. And then he asks, He'achi haderech le'avato v'yirato. What is the way that a person is supposed to come to love God and to fear Him? And so he says that the way to love God is to study His world. And he says, B'sha'ah she'yitbonen ha'adam b'ma'asav u'bru'av hanifla'im ha'gedolim. When a person studies the works of God, the creations of God, the wondrous, great creations of God, and you see the immense wisdom that has no end in what it is that He's put out. Look what he says over here. Miyad hu ohev. He immediately loves. And he praises and exalts and has deep yearning and desire to know the great name of God. Right? So there's a lot that we can look at over here. We have to understand this over here. What is Harambam saying? Why is that a way to come to love God? Who can tell me? I'm asking now for somebody to respond to me. Why is that a way to love God? You can unmute. How does looking at the world that God created bring us to loving Him?
Gratitude.
Gratitude for what He's given us.
Gratitude for the beauty and the functions of nature and awe at the creations in nature.
So there are two things that you're saying. You're saying gratitude and awe. Yeah? So gratitude would mean, let's just examine that, right? Gratitude for the beauty of nature and awe for its grandeur, if I understand you correctly. And I
So-
come to love him, but still I want to understand specifically, why am I loving him as a result of those things?
His
to
creation,
appreciate the attention to detail, that things weren't just merely put on earth, but there were mechanisms and ways that they should function properly, that they should be in harmony, that there was tremendous thought put into everything that's on earth.
Absolutely, Gail. I cannot disagree with a thing that you say. But why should that bring me to love God?
because his creation is so beyond anything that we can create.
Thank you, Barbara. It is.
It's beyond.
But we're dancing around something that is so obvious that nobody's
Because-
saying it.
Maybe
Because it was created for us. It was done for
By
us,
whom?
by God.
Yes. That's the
I want-
thing. Wait, and that's obvious. Everybody assumes that. That's why nobody's saying it, because it's obvious. Because essentially what is assumed over here is that what is put out by him for us as an act of love, but it is also an expression of his to us, right? We realize that it's not some arbitrary act, correct? This is something that is coming from
Right.
him. It's a way that he has expressed himself to us as an act of love. And so when we recognize that, we are recognized that this is coming from him as an act of love to us. And therefore we immediately love. But there's more to it than that. Because what I'm
Well,
suggesting, this is important, so hold on, right? Just be careful with the muting, only so that we have, clarity so people can hear the ideas, yeah? What I'm suggesting is more than simply that. This is the first point. What I'm suggesting is that the expressions that we experience are not just gifts to us. They are not just gifts. They are, as I mentioned, expressions. They are the way that God is showing himself to us. So let's take a look at another source, because the Rambam comes back to this question of loving God elsewhere. He comes back to this question of loving God at the very end of the book. This is the very beginning of the book. At the very end of the first of his 14 books of the Mishneh Torah, which ends essentially with the laws of Teshuvah. Yeah, he speaks about it again. And I want to take a look at that with you. All right, so I'm going to share the screen here. Can you see my screen? Yeah? Okay. So he talks about love in general, right? So let me bring this up. He talks about love in general, and he says, look, it's very important, whether you love God or not, never say that you are serving God for any ulterior motives. Even if you are, right? Even if you're not at a point where you're serving God for complete wholesome love, you are serving God for ulterior motives. And what are ulterior motives? What are the ulterior motives? Ulterior motives are, you're serving God because you want to get reward. You're serving God because you want to save yourself from punishment. Those are ulterior motives. Even if the reward is something as lofty as Olam Haba, as the world to come, it is not the way that anybody is supposed to be serving God, because we're not supposed to be serving God for payment. We're not supposed to be engaging in acts of love for payment. And so the Rambam says at the very beginning, he says, Al yomar adam hareni oseh mitzvot haTorah ve'osek b'chokhmata kedei shekabel kol habrachot haktubot ba. A person shouldn't say, says Harambam, that I am going to now engage in the laws of the Torah and engage in its wisdom so that I get the blessings that are written in it, or in order that I should get Olam Haba, she'ezkeh l'chayei Olam Haba, befrosh min ha'averot, I'm going to keep from doing the averot, she'ezhira Torah, God warned me to stay away from, biskedei she'natzel min ha'klalot, so I should save myself from any curses that are written in the Torah. He says, En ra'ui la'avod et Hashem ala derech hazeh, it is unfitting to serve God this way. Why? Because you serve God this way, you are only serving out of fear. And what does it mean that you're serving out of fear? Not fear of him, per se, of his greatness, just fear that something bad is going to happen. And that is not the way that a person is supposed to serve God. And so he says, rather, what a person is supposed to do is to serve from love. And essentially, what Harambam's entire thrust of the whole thing, the whole endeavor, is to get a person to move from living life of fear, to living a life from love. And all of you might be thinking right now, well, what does it have to do with the Western Sephardic people? Has Rabbi Dweck completely gone off the topic? I guarantee you I have not gone off the topic. Bear with me. But first, I want to lay this groundwork. Because what I am suggesting over here is that Harambam, who never stopped signing his name, by the way, Sephardi, the Spaniard, on purpose. He spent only 20 years of his life in Spain. By the time that he was 20 years old, he had to leave Cordoba with his family because of the Almohad dynasty that had come in as a new caliphate and was much more strict and fundamentalist than the Muslims that were there prior. And so they were less tolerant of the Jews. And so he had to run for his life together with his family. And still, he never stopped signing his name Sephardi, the Spaniard, because he believed that the Torah of his youth, of the first 20 years of his life, that he learned in that place was absolutely paramount to anything. And so when I say Harambam says, I'm saying that Harambam says this is all based on Harambam's Torah, the way that Harambam understood Torah and the way that Harambam understood the world. And what he says is that essentially a person's goal is to move from serving God and living with God, and for that matter, living in his world, from a place of fear to reaching a place of love. Which is why he ends the first book this way. And then the name of the second book, right, there are 14 volumes that he wrote, 14 volumes of the Mishneh Torah. And so he ends with this concept of love, and the second volume is called Sefer HaAhava, the Book of Love. And he says that if you are going to serve God from love, it means that you serve God with no ulterior motives. You serve God simply because he's God. And it's the right thing to do. I'm paraphrasing over here, but it's all in Hilchot Teshuvah, Perek Yud, if you'd like to look at it. But what I'd like to look at to come back to our point about the world being an expression of God is this. He says this towards the end. Take a look. He says, Davar Yadua Ubarur. He says it is known and it is clear, right? There's no complications to this. It's clear and it's known. She'en ahavat HaKadosh Baruch Hu niksheret b'libo shel Adam, that the love of the Holy One cannot become tied to a person's heart until yishge ba tamid, until they are constantly in thought about it. V'yazov kol ma sheba'olam chutz mimena, and they leave everything else in the world aside from that focus. As it says, B'chol levavecha chol nafshecha, that a person is to love God, ve'avta et Adonai Elohecha, which we say in the Kriyat Shema every single day, twice a day, that you are to love God with all of your heart and all of your soul. Now here's the key, and everybody please stop what you're doing and pay attention to the next line. And he says, and these are very powerful statements, Eno ohev HaKadosh Baruch Hu ela b'dat she'yida'ehu. A person can only love God to the degree that one knows God. And he says it is in direct ratio. Al pi hade'ah tiyeh ha'ahava. Based on the level of knowledge of God will be the level of love for God that one has. Just to make sure you don't misunderstand him, he explicitly says, Im me'at me'at, if you know God a little bit, then the love is a little bit. Im harbe, harbe. If it's a lot, then it's a lot of love. But you cannot love God a lot if you know him a little bit, is what Harambam is saying. It is in direct proportion. The knowledge of God and the love of God are directly tied in direct proportion to each other, according to the Rambam. And he says, therefore, what does one need to do? Now, notice very carefully. This is very important. The Rambam then does not go ahead and say, therefore, drop everything that you're doing and study only Torah, because it's the only way you'll come to know God. It's not what he says. Now, that doesn't mean that the study of Torah is not a means to knowing God. Has v'shalom, of course it is. But look what Rambam writes. He says, Lefichach, therefore, tzarich adam leached atzmo ulhavin ulaskil bachochmot utbunot. Therefore, a person has to focus all they've got. If their desire is to know and love God, they've got to focus all they've got on the wisdoms, plural, and the understandings of those wisdoms. Hamodeim lo et kono, that teach you about your maker. So I'm going to go back to my question again at the opening. When the Rambam says, how does one love God? You study his world. Why does the Rambam say that? The Rambam says that because studying his world is how you come to know him, not just how you appreciate what he does. It's very important to understand the difference. It's not just appreciation for what he does. It is to know him through what it is that he's made. The world that God has made is his art. And in the same way that you come to know an author, that you come to know a musician, that you come to know an artist, that you come to know anyone who puts out themselves, expressions of their self in this world, you come to know them without meeting them directly, is how it is that you know God. Now, I don't know if you've had that experience. I imagine you must have. You're going to tell me that in your life, you have not heard music from an artist consistently that has made you fall in love? Never having met the artist? That all you want to do when you see that artist, if you have the great opportunity to meet the artist, is to tell them how much you love them because of how they've moved you with their work, simply by the way that they've shared of themselves with you? Have you not had that experience with an author? Have you not had that experience with an actor? Have you not had that experience with an artist? Have you not had that experience with a scientist who has taught you what he or she knows, but in the manner of their knowledge and expression of what they know, what they've discovered, you come to love them? It is not meeting them directly, it is meeting their expression, and through their expression you come to know them. And as we say in English, to know him is to love him. And that is what the Rambam is writing. To know the Holy One is to love him. And that's why he writes earlier, Miyad hu ohev, you immediately fall in love. And you cannot help but fall in love if you are a conscious human being. When you look at the world and what is in it, in its wholeness and beauty. And all the Rambam is saying is that is how we come to know God. And he quotes a Braita of Rabbi Meir, in where he says, Mitoch kach ata makir et mi she'amar v'haya ha'olam. From that you come to know and recognize who spoke and created the world. What does that have to do with us? It has everything to do with us, because the question at the end of the day is, do we look at the world, as I've mentioned before, as an elaborate distraction as religious Jews? Or do we look at the world as an elaborate expression of the Holy One? And therefore recognize that if we are going to come to know him, we must study all that he put out in that world. And that is something that I honestly will say that I find very difficult to understand how it is that people negate that. How can one say that, yes, I recognize that God created the world and all that is in it, and there is not, to my knowledge, one Orthodox, religious, God-fearing Jew, whatever label you want to put on the person, that doesn't say that doesn't acknowledge that the entire world and all that is in it is created by the Lord God. And yet, to say at the same time that all of it is one massive toxin, well, that I can clearly say to you without any shadow of a doubt, that it is not exclusive to the Sephardim. but it is absolutely a legacy of the Sephardim. Certainly the Andalusian Sephardim, certainly the Western Sephardim, certainly the Sephardim that see the Rambam as the great thinker and progenitor, essentially, of this derech, that hold that the world is the way we come to know God, not what we're supposed to keep away from in order to be able to be faithful to God. And therefore, we study everything that we can in it to the degree that we can. And we delight in that study. And so I will say, it's easy to say, well, it's great, study mathematics. Yeah, well, no, that's not, I'm not only talking about mathematics. Study science. Well, I'm not only talking about science either, although it's wonderful to study that. Because my question is, who created Bach? And who created Freud? And who created the Beatles? And who created all of those greats? Who created J.K. Rowling? And who created Tolkien? Who created them? Is it not the Lord God? Are they not creations of mind and spirit that we must be intrigued to understand? And yes, I know what you're all thinking, that among those different souls and minds that God created are vile ones, despicable ones, evil ones. And they too intrigue us, don't they? What is it about this world? Why is the darkness in it? That's a question. And through understanding it, we come to understand him as well. Why is there the darkness? And why is there the evil and the suffering? And I will say, and I ask you to please pay close attention to this, even in a world that is an expression of God, and where the study of all of its grandeur and its detail and its minutia is a mode of coming to know him, there are toxins for human beings. We cannot eat everything in this world. We cannot be in every atmosphere in this world. As a matter of fact, the world and the universe in which it is embedded is hostile to life. And so we must be careful. And yes, the same Rambam that writes that in order to know God and to love God, we have to study the world that he created, is the Rambam that said, just because, and this is so important, pay attention to this, that just because just because we think doesn't mean that we think accurately and we think appropriately, that we think rationally. That, says the Rambam, takes rigor and preparation. This is not license for a free-for-all. This is not license to simply go and consume all that one sees. In the same way that if you want to get to know a human being, you do not simply run in rapture towards them, do you? You carefully check your boundaries and theirs. You get to know who it is that you want to know, gradually, cautiously, with respect, with sensitivity. You question where you're allowed to go and where you aren't in the interaction. And there is no difference between us and other human beings in that capacity and us and God. If anything, one has to be more careful with God than we are with other people. It's why, by the way, when God gives the Torah, he demands in an almost eccentric way that Moses makes sure that the boundaries around the mountain are intact. Check the story. It's quite strange. the degree to which God insists Moses goes down and checks the boundaries over and over again, even though Moses says explicitly to him, yeah, I checked the boundaries already. God says, no. You better go down there and check. You don't understand. When I come down on that mountain, people are going to rush the mountain in rapture and they will die. So what am I saying about the Sephardim in all of this? What I'm saying is that historically, the Sephardim have seen the world as an expression of God, and they have fallen in love with him, and they have sought constantly to know him through that world. And so they have always engaged with it. And to whatever capacity they could, they have integrated themselves with it. And when they have done it righteously, and they have not always done it righteously, because among every society there are its scholars and there are its simpletons. There are its thinkers and there are its lay people. And the way the lay people engage has a great deal to do with the teachings and standards that are set by the scholars and leaders. Sometimes it's strong and sometimes it's faulty. But it is a risk that we take. Others would say, don't take the risk. Stay behind closed doors. Keep your hands and legs inside the tram at all times. Traditionally, it hasn't been the approach of the Sephardim. The approach of the Sephardim has been go out and experience. Because it is mitoch kach, from that ataba makir mi she'amar v'haya olam. You come to recognize who spoke and created the world. And that's what Yom Kippur is for. The missteps, the hazards, the failures in the vigor and verve of engaging in that experience. Now, I'll show you why in a moment, but it is. I'm not being facetious about Yom Kippur. It's exactly what Yom Kippur is for. Yom Kippur is one day in the year in which you are supposed to realize that you cannot live that way. You understand? The reason we fast on Yom Kippur and we deprive ourselves, which is what initim means, right? In the Torah, it says, "Initim et nafshotechem," you should deprive yourselves, your souls. There's one day a year that the Torah tells us to deprive ourselves. Every other day of the year, we're not supposed to be depriving ourselves. One day a year, we deprive ourselves. Why? So that you should know what it means to live as a human being with that level of deprivation, and that you are not fit or set up to live that way. It's quite the contrary. You're meant to live in the world. You are meant to eat and drink and experience the physical engagement of life. And that is why the Sephardim and Yom Kippur, you know what the last line we read on Yom Kippur? The Sephardim? Last line the Ashkenazim say on Yom Kippur essentially is Adonai hu ha'Elohim. This is, again, not disparaging in any way. I'm simply showing the contrast, right? Adonai hu ha'Elohim, God is Lord, which is so apropos. I mean, how else would you end Yom Kippur? I mean, it is the way to end Yom Kippur. I mean, you end it on the highest holy point, right? You know what the Sephardim say? The last line, the Sephardim say, this is the line that everybody hears before they close out. You know what we say at the end of Yom Kippur? A pasuk. Lech echol b'simcha lachmecha. Go and eat your bread happily. Ushte belev tov yanecha, and drink your wine with a happy heart. Enjoy dinner. That's the last line the Sephardim say on Yom Kippur. Don't you think you should leave it at Adonai hu Elohim, right? Shouldn't we just leave with the Lord is God and let everybody go out on that spiritual high? No. The last thing that we have to say on a day completely spent, bowing before God, depriving ourselves in front of him, last thing we say, go enjoy dinner. Official. This is the official last line of Yom Kippur. And the reason we say that is because that is what you're meant to do. Because it is in that you are supposed to experience the world that God created. Not in gluttony, and again, not with indiscretion, but with respect and an understanding that this is what was given to you, as you said at the very beginning. This is God's act of love to us. So the Sephardim have always lived that way. Has there been casualty for the Sephardim? Yes, there has. There have been definitely examples of casualty where they have been lost in the world, and they have lost their way. But overall, it has definitely been a different way, a way in which we embrace everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to us. And it is the way that we come to understand and know him. Now, that said, and I think I've said enough of that. I'm not going to go on and on about that. There's the other side of it. The other side of it is that the author of the Torah is also God in our belief and understanding. And as I said at the beginning, the Torah is meant to be a lens through which we see the world. And it is also how the Sephardim have always seen it. That the Torah is a framework for thought and understanding. There are many frameworks through which, there are many lenses through which one can see the miscellany that is this world. And you can look at it in so many different disciplines. And you will know, of course, that depending on the discipline that a person is trained in is the way that they will see the world. A mathematician will not see the world in the same way as a poet. A biologist will not see the world in the same way as a neurologist or a physicist, for that matter. An engineer will not see the world the same. So everyone sees the world through a framework and a lens. And what our tradition is to see the world through the framework of Torah. That should be our lens. And that means then that Torah must be, and here's the kicker, so everybody pay close attention, that Torah must be taught as a framework, as a set of principles for thought, so that the details that I experience in this world can be understood and integrated into that framework. It must be taught as principles. I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but that is a very, very important idea that the Sephardim have very often espoused. And what that means is that if I understand the Torah as a framework, and it becomes a lens through which I look at and understand my world, whatever it is that the world presents me, I can see within that framework and integrate into that framework. Why is that important? It's important, especially now, because when you have a world that is rapidly developing, the world has always developed, and there have been many paradigm shifts in the course of history. But where we are right now, the world is changing and developing at an accelerated rate from what we've been used to. And so we get nervous because of it, because everything that we've come to know in the world is changing rapidly. And so, do you know what we do when the world is changing rapidly and everything we've come to know is dissolving before our eyes? The institutions that we have come to know is dissolving before our eyes. I think I mentioned the library last time, right? We dig our heels into what we do know. And that is why we're seeing these massive gravitations to extremes on either side, in my opinion. It's one of the reasons. I don't think there's a single reason for anything in this world, but it's one of the major reasons. And the people that are in the middle, which is very likely the silent majority, because those in the extremes are very vocal, and the ones in the middle are silent, but nonetheless uneasy, agitated, confused, because they know that life and the world is more nuanced than those on the extremes would have us believe. And that it is not black and white. Even though there are many, many who might dress that way. Perhaps to be able to calm and recognize that things can be, at least my clothes can be, simple if the world is not. There are many ways that we cope with these things. We're all human beings at the end of the day. And we are all dealing with the human condition. But seeing the Torah as a framework allows us to deal with the myriad of detail that is changing and developing, and allows for us to integrate it into an ever-expanding and developing framework. It gives us tools with which to live and think. So take a look at this. Take a look at some of these sources that I'm going to share with you. First thing I'm going to show you is a Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi, Reb Zeira says, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Kol Torah she'en la bet av ena Torah. It's a very powerful statement of the Yerushalmi. This, by the way, is the opening line of Rav Ovadia Yosef's introduction to his Teshuvot, to his response to Yad B'Omer. And that simply says that any detail of Torah, any data point of Torah that does not have literally a bet av as a father's house, right? What does that mean? That does not have a principal source, that it does not have a home with which it in which it belongs, right? A broader category from which it comes, it's not Torah. You can have a detail that sounds like Torah, feels like Torah, smells like Torah, but is not Torah, because it lacks the context of Torah in order to be able to qualify it as such. The Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, a very famous, I know we had this argument last time, but I still maintain that he's a Western Sephardi from Italy, in Padua. He writes in his Derech Hashem, which incidentally was composed while he was in Amsterdam. He says, listen, he said, look, I mean, if we're going to try and understand things by looking at details, data points, we are hopeless. Why? Because they are massive. The number of details are massive and never ending. We can't even hold them all. And there's no way for a single human being to know all of them. Rather, what is appropriate for a person to contemplate and to engage and endeavor in, is to know principles, general principles. Because every principle will be able to house and does house massive amounts of detail. And when a person gets one major principle down, when you get a principle clear, you automatically get a whole bunch of details, and not just details, but contextualized details. The meaning of those details comes with the principle. Because as we all know, even though we do not like to recognize, that all meaning lives only in context. There is no such thing as inherent meaning to any detail. Meaning is found in context. And you know this because if you've been alive in the world for enough time, you have at one time or another had your words taken out of context. And you know how infuriating that can be, because you cannot say, I didn't say that. What you have to try and say is, I didn't mean that. And good luck with that. Because what that requires is a reforming of what was said, not a restating of what was said. And that is why any of you who actually do text on your phones understand how important it is to use emojis and appropriate punctuation. Because you will write something in a text, and unless the person who is receiving the text knows you really well and therefore knows the context within which it was said, are bound to be misunderstood, because text needs context for it to have an appropriate meaning. And what is the context for our speaking, for our speech? Is it not the nonverbals? the tone of voice, the facial expressions. It's always about principles, my friends, because it's in the principles that we find our context and therefore our meaning. And it is in that that we understand the details of our world and how they come to us. Even though you don't know all the details yet, you don't even know the details of this specific principle. Once you know a principle, you have tools. You have the mode with which to understand. And therefore, Amruzal, the Hachamim said, and listen to this, an unbelievably amazingly beautiful line and how important it is. Amruzal, the Hachamim said, Le'olam, always, Yu divrei Torah biyadecha klalim. Let the words of Torah be principles in your hand, not details. That is how you learn Torah. Because if I'm going to come to know God, and I'm going to study his world, and I'm going to study, for that matter, even his Torah, I need to know within which framework I'm meant to understand it. And as a Jewish person in covenant with the Lord God, the Holy One, I need to see his world through the Torah that is the framework for my covenant, and to know him through it. That's what we're about. And therefore, the Rambam says beautifully at the opening of Masechet Brachot, he says, I want you to know, dear reader, Yakar be'enai lelamed ikar mi'ikari hadat. It is more precious in my eyes to teach a basic fundamental principle of this religion we've got, right? This whole belief system we've got. Yoter mikol asher alamedehu. More than anything else that I teach, teaching principles is most important to me. The reason he says that is because he goes off on this whole tangent in this Mishnah, in Perek Tet, a Brachot, to explain a particular principle of belief. And so he says, I want you to understand the reason I've done that is because it is more precious in my eyes to teach you principle than anything else that I'm going to teach. And the Rambam taught everything. And the Rambam is saying it's more important to teach principles than anything else that I will teach. Why are the principles so important? And then I will open for questions. The principles are important because you understand nothing in this world without them. The only question is, which principles are you using? All of us run through life with principles in our heads. Many of them we have never considered before. So they've just been downloaded into our minds from our parents and our society and our community and so on and so forth. It is just the way that we think. And much more difficult than changing what you think about is changing how you think, the way you think. And the reason why it's very difficult to change the way you think is because you think with the thing that you're thinking with. In other words, the tool that you use to think is the thing that thinks itself. And how are you supposed to change that? There's only one way to do it. Outside thinkers. Thinking that doesn't happen in your brain. And little by little, we calibrate ourselves with other minds. That's how our minds calibrate themselves, with other minds. Otherwise, we go nuts. And so the way of the Sephardim, and specifically throughout time, the Western Sephardim, has always been to study the Torah as principles and to give those over and to focus much less on the letter and nuance and minutia. Not that they are not important, they are very important. But to focus less on those and to teach more how we do, the way we do, the manner in which we do, the manner in which we see, the manner in which we think, and through that, embrace the entire world that God created. Mind you, being sensitive to toxins, learning and understanding things in that nature. And through that, we come to know God. And so what I am suggesting is that in the world now, in our times, currently, when things are moving very fast, and paradigms are shifting, and the way that we have seen things is changing, certainly the way that our children and grandchildren are seeing things, experiencing a world, not how we did. To question what does Torah say about that? One cannot ask how Torah is seeing things, how Torah would relate to things, if we do not see Torah as a set of principles, as a system of philosophy and thought. And that is what we need to teach. It's something that Sephardim have been doing for a very, very long time. So I will open with questions, given that we've only had a very short period of time in order to be able to talk this out. Shall I go through them, Rabbi Kelman?
You can go through them if you want. I can go through them with you.
I can go through.
Okay.
I can go through. So let's see. איפה כתוב וידעת את השם אלוהיך? It doesn't say וידעת השם אלוהיך. It says וידעת היום והשבות רבך כי אדוני הוא אלוהים. And says that we have that part of the inyan is here. I'll show it to you where the Rambam brings it. Over here. It's not an exact pasuk. It's a phrase. Okay. Here we go. The Rambam writes that the mitzvah of knowing God, here, let me put this up for you. The Rambam writes the mitzvah of knowing God comes from the pasuk v'yediat davar zeh, right? There's a mitzvah to know this. He opens up saying like this: Yesod yesodot ve'amud hachokmot leda sheyesh matzur rishon, to know that there is primal existence, which is how he defines God. And then he goes to define this primal existence, and he says hamatzui hazeh hu Elohei ha'olam. This primal existence is the Lord of the world, right? He's the God of the world. And he says v'yediat davar zeh mitzvat aseh. The knowledge of this is a positive commandment because it says Anochi Adonai Elohecha, which is an imperative. I am the Lord your God. The difference between saying Ani and Anochi means what I am existentially, as opposed to what I am in the world as an active being. And so the Rambam understands this to be a mitzvah itself, Anochi Adonai Elohecha. But there are many places in the Torah where it says that we have to know God, or in the Nevi'im for that matter. David HaMelech, before he dies, tells Shlomo, Atabini, my son, da et Elohei avicha ve'avdehu. Know the God of your father and serve him. Yeah. So there are many psukim that express that. Let me stop this and go back. But what if your situation is not good? You are in pain, born with medical problems, a slave, living in a harsh environment, suffering through bad nature, hurricanes, earthquakes. Indeed. A very important question. Suffering. I would be very happy. Not happy. I mean, I would oblige to give a class on that, if so wish, if it is wished, that to be able to look at how it is, because I would never treat a powerful and important question like that glibly in 3 minutes and answer it appropriately. But it is an important question, and there are answers that Torah presents to that are much more complex than I can offer now. So I leave that to Rabbi Kelman and the group. If you wish, 1 or 2 things on that, it would be my pleasure to do. The challenge is to believe that everything is for the good. Yes, ultimately. I mean, when we say everything is for the good, there's this line in the Gemara, Kol de'avid rahamana letav avid. All that the loving one does is for good, or like Nachumish Gamzu, right? Gamzu letova. But that's talking about the broad overarching move of the entirety of creation. But yes, of course, we have to say that if we understand God as being who God is. Remember the morning blessing, creator of all, and original from created. I'm sorry, I don't understand exactly that. I apologize. In the passage, the Rambam says that women are at the level. He did say that. Thank you, Michelle. And the Rambam was saying that because at the time of the Rambam, women were not educated. But the Rambam also writes in that very same place, Ad sheterbeh da'atan, until their knowledge is enhanced. And he includes women in that. V'avdu me'ahava. And what he also says is that everybody has a requirement of loving God, and therefore everybody has a requirement of knowing everything that they need to know in order to be able to achieve that love, which includes women without question. So he was simply talking about the circumstance of time. That's why he says, Amei ha'aretz. He says also general population of men are ignorant, knowing nothing. And so therefore they need to be educated appropriately.
Rabbi,
of course it can. Sorry?
I was just going to interrupt, if I may, and say the Rambam, we need another class on this too. The Rambam is very progressive in terms of his attitudes towards women, considering he lived in the 12th century.
Tremendously.
Very
but it's also absolutely.
Rambam and Rashi were probably the two most I don't know what the words you want to use, but progressive, pro-woman. You have to, in the context of the time. But that's
Absolutely. The context of the time is essential.
and
And it is
despite the context, has a much more thing. Yes,
absolutely true. I agree.
They were tech. It was true. But anyways, that's for a whole other share. But I just want
Indeed. To know God through his works has led some modern Sephardi thinkers to label it the study of the natural world as a mitzvah and study as chovah. I'm sorry, I'm not understanding exactly the syntax of the question. I apologize that I'm not gathering the essence of the question in that.
If people want to speak up, unmute yourself. If you ask one of the questions, maybe you can wait till the end. You can do that or rephrase it, but then you can actually speak in person. But we'll do that after you go through the rest of the questions, Rabbi.
I'll leave that to you. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that in an earlier class you said the Enlightenment did not reach the non-European. Yeah. So what happened was with the Sephardim that did not get touched by the Enlightenment is that they completely lost that. And so there were Sephardim among them. There were people among them that decided to go the Ashkenazi route, right, and say, well, they've done it, so we better just follow them. And then there was Sephardim that said, well, we've got to kind of come to understand this and come to terms with this. And so there were different ways that the Sephardim dealt with it. Although that is why I was very careful to talk about Western Sephardi approach and Andalusian approach as well. Not all Sephardim are cut from the same cloth. Yeah. Ramchal was Ashkenazi. Thank you. We'll carry on with that as we go, but I will take a look at that. Thank you. The Rabbi addressed this point last week. Ramchal, thank you. Okay, so Sina was dealing with it. Readers should examine the information presented there inside from themselves. Okay. Can you give us an example of one of those principles Sephardim focused on? Sorry. Which principles? If I was talking.
Broad principles. I assume that's what the question is. When they're sort of worship of gods as opposed to all the millions of details.
Right. So the question is what are the principles of thought as far as the Torah is concerned, right? So, I mean, there are many things like that. What does it mean to be modest, and why? What is considered modesty? Where do we find in the Torah? The Torah presents things this way. Well, the first one to be modest was God. He conceals himself. He brings his light away from the world. Why does he do that? What is he concerned with? What does it mean for us to do that? Yeah, things like that. That's what I mean by studying principles, right? What is going on, right? Why is God doing these things? Why is he presenting these ideas? And what do they mean? And how are we supposed to understand them to be able to build a broad framework for our understanding in our lives in order to be able to understand the world that way? Yeah. When he tells Avraham, Lech lecha, go for you, Avraham. Yeah. Well, there are many ways to understand it as we see Chazal, right? But if we look through the Talmud, we have to understand, for example, how do Chazal understand that? Why do they look at things in a particular way? Or you will see even the Rambam will paskin a midrash in situations. Yeah. So am I supposed to learn from Avraham Avinu that I'm supposed to explore the world? Am I supposed to learn from Lech Lecha that it's important for me to be able to value myself? Yeah. I mean, according to Rashi, Lech Lecha means letovatcha lehanatcha, for your good and for your enjoyment. Did anyone pick up on that? Well, sure, they picked up on that. Aharon Kohen picked up on that, and he ended up dedicating his entire life to Ohev Tabriot Karavan Torah, and so he becomes the one that teaches us about. Then, of course, is Hillel Azaken who picks on that for there and tells us that we should be mitalmidav shel Aharon. He's the one that says, if I'm not going to take care of myself, who's going to take care of me, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? There are these principles that we need to be able to understand in order to be able to form a framework of the Torah, so that we can understand how to deal with these kinds of things and what the Torah says. But obviously, being principles in a life's study, again, not to be glibly addressed in under an hour. Yes. The morning blessing. So God is the originator of evil. The morning blessing has been edited, if you will recognize, by Chazal, which was taken from Pasuk that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Borei Ra, that it created evil. We have to understand what that means exactly and why. Again, not for 2 minutes. But I would include that in the shiur on suffering. Did the Rambam's teaching reach the non-European Sephardim? Yes, it did. Yes, it did. If so, can we say that they were enlightened way before the Enlightenment? It did, but they rejected it a great deal. They had a tremendous problem with the Rambam's teachings in as far as this is concerned. There was a great deal of struggle even within Spain itself, because there were two sections of Spain. There was Christian Spain and Muslim Spain. So it's very famous that there were bans placed on the Rambam's writings, and there were things that that people didn't want to necessarily deal with, and then there were others that came to kind of support the Rambam's it's a whole development. Yeah, but I'm putting out one perspective of it for what it's worth. So I think that's it. I don't know if there's anything else.
Okay, anybody else want to orally speak? But thank you very much for the enlightening, series about the Enlightenment. Okay, thank you. And the Sephardim, and now that we're all mixed, it used to be for 100 years a Sephardi never met an Ashkenazi in his life.
Right, everybody's mixed, which is nice because things are moving in where they're supposed to be.
You lived in Spain, unless you were a traveler, you spent your whole life, you never met an Ashkenazi Jew.
True.
And vice versa. And
we were all, that's the beautiful thing, we're coming out of the silos.
So now
Am Yisrael is learning how to get together.
Intermarriage, Baruch Hashem, and how that will impact on halacha. That's for another discussion. Well, will Ashkenazim start eating kitniyot in 25 years? In other words, the trend is being the Ashkenazim influencing the Sephardim, but there's also a little bit of
both sides, both ways. There's a mixing of cultures, which is a lovely thing. So my thing, I'll just say one thing on that, so that I can, just to qualify this whole presentation about Sephardim. I think that it is absolutely essential that what happens to Klal Yisrael is that the various threads that for so long, like you say, Rabbi Kelman, lived entirely on their own, are now coming to be, integrated into a broad tapestry. And the challenge is to be able to be in harmony so that the various instruments and sounds, if you will, right, to use an analogy, that are made by the nation of Israel should be able to come together in tandem without any one of them being drowned out and lost. I should be able to come to the table and lend my unique experience to the broad framework or the broad integration of the nation without completely losing and dissolving the uniqueness of my identity into it, if that makes sense. And that's what I think is important for us to understand.
Okay.
Again, from my, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. This evening, Mark Shapiro continues his talks on his fascinating books of letters with rabbinic authorities across the spectrum, Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And for those who have come, if you haven't come, each class is really independent from the previous one. Each one discusses a series of his correspondence. 8:30 this evening. Tomorrow morning, we're starting a new series, a 6-part series on Introduction to Midrash by Simi Peters, live from Yerushalayim. So we invite everybody. If you haven't registered yet, you have to register for that separately, please. That would be appreciated. And that's more at 11 a.m. And then the rest of the schedule, regular for the week, our Thursday night Parsha Shir this week will be given by Wendy Amselin. And we look forward to learning with you. I always look forward to your comments, advice, critiques, suggestions. Thank you, and everybody have a wonderful day. Be well, be safe, and
I just want to thank everybody for the time that I've been able to spend with you and for sharing with everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Kelman.
you again.
Thank you very much.
And
Incredible.
I want to thank you all, and okay, always a pleasure to learn. And Sina Kahin, I want to thank him. He's online. He was the one who originally contacted me. Sina, we haven't met, but he contacted me by email, and if I be Rabbi Dweck speaks, I want to thank you for making the shidduch. And okay, everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Bye-bye.